This is a true story. Every time I tell it, it draws the eyes of everyone in the room. I'm not sure why I haven't posted it before, but upon reflecting with a friend, I decided it was time to share. In the summer of 2020, my friends, Alex and Violet, and I decided to go on a mountain vacation. COVID cabin fever had hit us hard and we were desperate to get out. We settled on a mountainous estate and planned to camp and hike at several different locations. For one night, we thought it would be fun to book a cabin in the woods. Violet's parents had rented a fire tower once and loved it, but a cabin beside a fire tower was all we could find. It was cheap, clean, and secluded. Excited to have a night where we could be as obnoxious as we wanted, we booked it. In the weeks leading up to the trip, we decided it would be a great idea to drop acid at the cabin. Violet bought an entire sheet in preparation for our arrival, but it was tucked in her bag. As we pulled out the driveway to make our way to the cabin, I remembered this knot in the pit of my stomach, this aching feeling that gnawed at me. I told Alex and Violet that there was no way I could drop acid that night. Violet was pissed. We turned around and got into a massive argument, but I stood my ground. I just knew that we had no business tripping that night. Finally, the fireworks settled and we were off. The cabin was roughly 30 minutes away from the nearest town. It sat atop a mountain. We held our breath as we rounded the busted road that spiraled toward the top. There were no pull-offs, no other campsites, just a long winding road that led us to the cabin at the peak. We settled in and started a fire to keep warm. As dusk gave way to night, we heard the unmistakable noise of an engine on the road, then the flash of headlights. A side-by-side with 3 kids arrived and our nerves settled. They smiled, gave us a wave, climbed the fire tower and left. We'd heard there may be occasional visitors to the fire tower, but they were the only ones who'd come by. We doused the fire and moved inside, heated some hot dogs until they were lukewarm, ate them fast and sat in the silence. You don't know how quiet it is until you're in the middle of nowhere. You can hear every rustle of the leaves, the whisper of the wind through their branches. You get so used to white noise living in a city. There's always the hum of an air conditioner or the dim roar of traffic to focus on. Here, the closest thing to white noise was the sound of our own breathing. We jumped at every noise, too frightened to speak to one another, and finally, I'd had enough. I cracked a few wine coolers, passed them to Alex and Violet, and slapped a board game down on the table between our bunk beds. It didn't take long for us to loosen, and we were laughing, having the raucous good time we envisioned. Much soberer than we'd thought, but enough that we were able to ignore the rumble of the woods. Later, we'd all recall hearing noises in the background, the snap of a twig, the dim rumble of an engine. None of us wanted to rupture the air of nonchalance between us, so we ignored it. Until a human hand reached up to the window between us and slapped it 3 times. We were screaming in an instant. Alex called 911, put them on speakerphone, and handed his cell to me. He grabbed pokers from the fireplace and passed them out. Violet started calling family members and saying her last goodbyes. I held my breath and listened for any more noise. Whoever this was, whatever this was, would have heard us call 911, and now they were being careful to make a silent retreat. Dispatch arrived 20 minutes later, a lucky thing for a 1 a.m. emergency call, and had their dogs comb the mountain. Nothing. They suggested it may have been a bear, but I could tell from their faces that they didn't believe that for a second. We'd barely cooked those hot dogs, and why would a bear smack the window by a couple of screaming kids rather than the one closest to the pan we'd used to cook? Why would a bear knock on the window like a human? Why, when we screamed, did the bear make a stealthy retreat? They had no answers, but they had one anecdote. As they'd sped to us, they'd come across a car at the base of the mountain, but that was the only sign of life they'd seen. I remember my blood ran cold, but Violet and Alex were too frazzled to absorb the weight of what they'd said. And dizzied by a new horror, Violet's car, thoroughly dusted by our drive up the mountain, was covered in handprints. Handprints that didn't match ours, that touched places we hadn't. We grabbed our stuff by the armful and threw it inside. Eager to remove every part of ourselves from this mountain, we followed the police, grateful every pothole found us further and further from that wretched cabin. We made it down in record time and found lodging at a seedy hotel that reeked of cat urine. I couldn't sleep. The thought of that car on the road rang in my head. Remember, there was nothing else on that mountain. It was a narrow road to the top, no pull-offs, no other campsites. There was the fire tower. Maybe a visitor decided to spook us during their late night excursion. But the kids from earlier, we'd seen their headlights. Whoever did this had stopped their vehicle further down the road and hiked the rest of the way. They didn't want to be spotted. They wanted silence, secrecy. Whoever this was hadn't been looking for a cheap scare, they'd planned this. I don't think I'll ever know what the person on the mountain wanted from me. I don't know if it was a practical joke or the beginning of a night of terror. I'm grateful for Alex's quick wit in calling 911. I wonder if our visitor knew we had service. It had certainly been a welcome surprise to us. Perhaps that was a wrench in his plan, enough to spook him before he could make things ugly. In truth, I don't know if I want to know. My boyfriend, 23 male, and I, 23 female, recently decided that we wanted to take the tent we bought on its first trip. The tent was one that hooks up to your car to provide more storage space, and we were excited to try it out. We had planned a kayaking trip the next day at a kayak rental shop. It was supposed to be a nice, inexpensive, outdoorsy weekend getaway. We tend to book things last minute, so all the state parks and professional campgrounds were full. This led us to a website that is essentially an Airbnb for campsites. The place we chose was a 100-acre property just 20 minutes south of the kayak shop. Of all the sites in the area, it was described as having working bathrooms, showers, it allowed for campfires, and all the sites were car accessible, which was important for a car-dependent tent. This site was also the most reviewed in the area, with 3 5-out-of-5-star reviews. The area was very rural, so we did not think much about the low number of reviews for any of the campsites. The renter was Mary, who only ever texted us updates, but seemed sweet. We started our 2-hour drive a bit later than anticipated, which put us behind the 11 AM time we had originally informed the host. But we tried to keep her updated with the new schedule. She just told us to let her know when we arrive at the address she sent us. We arrived at the address and were greeted with the barn from the pictures. It had string lights all over it, seemed fairly new, and had a nice atmosphere. We sat in the car for a minute and struggled with cell service to text the host to let her know we had arrived. 10 minutes after our text sends, a sweaty man who appears to be in his 60s pulls up in an ATV. He lets us know he is the father-in-law to Mary and she is busy taking care of the seasonal harvest and sent him instead. He lets us know we can take the car anywhere on the property and offers to show us around it in the ATV. My boyfriend, visibly uncomfortable, declines the offer and asks a few more questions about the woods and how far into them we are allowed to take the car. Anywhere, he responds. There are no designated campsites. We can go anywhere, and the ATV man offers to help pull my car out if it gets stuck. We ask one final question about cell service, and he jokes that if we are from around here, we will understand that reception works better on one side of the barn than the other. I am from around here, and thought it was funny, but once he said that, I realised he didn't have any ounce of an accent for here like he should. Eventually he leaves, and we begin exploring the property on foot. The barn is nice and maintained. It was fully lit in the middle of the day, with the string lights decorating the interior too. It is insulated and has a working kitchen. The only warning we got was to not drink the water. It seemed like a place that would host small 50-guest weddings. We walked past a shed out behind the barn to get to the trails that ran through the woods. After going through a hike that my car would have never survived, we decided it might be best just to camp by a small creek, and we chose a spot on the side opposite the barn. We were still within walking distance, but we used my car as a buffer to feel a bit more isolated. After choosing our spot, we head into the main town to eat and walk around. We message Mary about the fire policy, and she tells us that they will deliver a fire ring to the barn for us to take to camp. We arrive back at the barn about an hour and a half from night time. We drive by the barn, and the lights had been turned off. We assume it was on a timer as to not waste energy or money. We also noticed the fire ring had not yet been delivered. We start the grueling 30-minute setup in the sticky heat and reward ourselves with a seat in the air-conditioned car. We noticed it looks like it's about to rain, so my boyfriend and I pull out a card game and wait for it to pass in the car. It only lasted about 10 minutes, but sunset is starting. The tent held up nicely, so we felt okay leaving it for a second. Needing to use the bathroom, we start walking to the barn. As we cross the creek, we hear what sounds like someone in the shed moving things around. A bit unsettling, but I tell my boyfriend that maybe they used the equipment today and it's just sitting in there making the cracking cool-off noise that it sometimes does. We get to the barn and the lights are still off, but the fire ring is there. We go in and check to make sure the power is off and it's not just the lights outside. None of the light switches work, so we assume the power is cut. Again, maybe it's just on a timer, no worries. We step out of the barn and get 10 feet away and we hear a hum in the distance to the opposite side of the shed. The power to the barn is restored. We change direction to use the bathroom. As soon as we step outside, the power cuts. I start to get a weird feeling, and I can tell he has it too. I look to my boyfriend and say, maybe they're just watching us. I immediately follow it up with, "No, that's a lot worse." We walk back inside and the lights turn on. My boyfriend says that we need to leave, and I have the same gut-wrenching primal fear. We put the ring back by the barn since we had moved it 10 feet, and the barn lights start flickering. We briskly walk back to the car. Being from Appalachia, I know better than to run. The 30-minute setup was torn down and packed up in 5 minutes, and we jump in the car and lock the doors. I managed to get my car going, thanking God that the rain did not get my car stuck. We start toward the driveway, and just as we made it to the road, my boyfriend looks back and sees a man standing by the shed, watching us. As soon as my car pulls off onto the road, we get a text from Mary, letting us know that the fire ring is out by the barn. She also informs us that we are welcome to stay in the barn if the rain had messed up our camping experience. We arrive at a nice hotel, willing to splurge for safety. At this point, it's 10 PM at the earliest. A sweet older lady checks us in, desperate for validation and just comfort from anyone. We tell her what had just happened to us at the campsite. She looks shocked. She asks if we had seen the news lately, which we both respond that we had not. The lady tells us that couples in the state have been going missing. All of them had gone camping. 3 couples were truly missing, and 1 was recently found on the side of the freeway slashed to near death. They are, to the time we're posting, still recovering in hospital. We couldn't find many articles about where in the state, but the look on the lady's face suggested it was near us. We get to our room and text Mary back to tell her we're not staying. "Thank you for staying with us," she responds. We lock the door and I break down into tears. I will not forget the feeling I got at the barn. The primal fight or flight feeling and the feeling of being watched. I feel it in my throat just writing this. I never want to experience that again. At the time this happened, I was a 13-year-old female. So this happened 2 years ago, and I was fairly naive. I was a major introvert, only friends with a few people in my class. I wanted to be social, but I preferred to be alone and read or write, classic nerd things. In early November, I got a text on my phone that was from a few classmates whose phone numbers I had, and around 1 or 2 that I couldn't recognise. It was a group chat, asking if we wanted to hang out at night near a park at our school. My parents, being strict and paranoid, would never let me go. Luckily, or what I thought was luck, they were heading out for an overnight trip and would be back early in the morning. Everything fell into place. Once my parents left around 8 PM, I ran out the door and made my way to the park. The one thing I made sure to do was lock the door. My parents were paranoid after all, and it was their biggest thing that they engraved into me. Once I arrived at the park, I noticed a creepy figure near the edge of the woods. No one else seemed to notice it, and I already had enough reputation as a weirdo who was true crime obsessed. I didn't mention it. The night drew on and on. I was having the time of my life, ignoring the gut feeling I had telling me to run. Every so often I would look over my shoulder and the man would still be standing there. Around 9:45, 4 out of 10 people had to leave due to their curfew. It was getting cold and was nearly pitch black with a few streetlights. The rest of us decided to go as well, since it felt more eerie and quiet. The place we were hanging out at was a field that was fenced in with a few exits and entrances. A large wide field with a small park in the back and our giant middle school behind us. The front of the field faced the empty road and the right and left sides were surrounded by forest. All of the people left were getting picked up by cars, meaning that they went the opposite way of the road, since that's where the parking lot was. A man stood by the right forest and road exit that I needed to take to get home. I walked away from the group and tried to steady my heavy breathing. I didn't want to be paranoid, but all the true crime I listened to was invading my thoughts. The man was probably in his early 40s or late 30s, dark hair with a beard. He was around 5'9", but at the time it seemed like 6 foot. He stood about 10 feet from the exit I had to take, so when I got close enough to it, I ran for about 30 feet through the exit and through the woods. Once I felt safe enough, I started to quickly walk through the woods to get to the road. I heard a snap and a crunch from behind me. I stopped walking for a second and quickly checked over my shoulder. Around 15 feet behind me stood the very same man. He was walking slowly behind me, almost as if he was trying to not be suspicious, but it only made my fear worse. I turned around and walked so quickly I was basically jogging. I lived about 10 minutes away from the park we had hung out at, and I wasn't athletic enough to run home. After roughly 7 minutes of walking fast, I was in my neighbourhood. I knew that I could run to my house if I had to, so I checked to see if he was still trailing behind me. To my horror, he was only 5 foot away. I ran faster than I ever ran. I could hear his footsteps behind me thumping across the concrete as he ran too. I dove down an alleyway I knew well and tried to lose him in the park, making my way home longer. I could hear his heavy breath followed by his footsteps as he tried to keep up. I cut through houses, backyards and front yards. I finally made it to my house and flew up the steps. I looked behind me and he had just arrived at the bottom of my stairs. I knocked the door and burst through it, shoving it closed behind me, and I heard him hit the door with his entire body. I ran around the house and locked all the windows, turned off the lights and hid in my bedroom with a kitchen knife, just in case he got in. Luckily, he did not. If this was a better world, that's where my story would have ended, but it does not. After a few months, I hadn't really told anyone what had happened, since I don't want to get in trouble with my parents for sneaking out. I didn't go out with anyone or any group anymore, returned to being a loner and never went out past 7. It was around February when a classmate of mine was sharing a story of some random man following her home on the bus. She described him almost the exact same as the man who had chased me home. Another girl mentioned that he sounded like the guy who stood outside the school and tried to follow her home. I didn't join in, but everyone agreed that he was a creep.